What's a fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory? Story 1. The Church of Scientology had members secretly infiltrate U.S. government agencies in order to destroy unfavorable documents and investigations into them. Funny addendum, they were also spying on Matt Stone and Trey Parker to try and blackmail them into backing off in South Park. They couldn't find anything more embarrassing than what Parker and Stone would already openly admit to the press. Story 2. Years ago, in the lead-up to the Olympics in Mexico, the country was embarrassed by massive protests about conditions for regular people there. So at one of the large protests, they put snipers from their CIA equivalent in some tall buildings near where there was due to be a protest by a large government building. That building was guarded by a line of police officers. When the protesters made it to the line of police officers, they continued to peacefully protest. The CIA equivalent officers opened fire on the police, making it appear that the protesters were shooting at the cops. The cops retaliated, mowing down countless protesters, thinking they were defending themselves. Protesters were killed and fled the scene. The government was ready, rushed in, and immediately cleaned up the scene. To this day, they have no idea how many people were killed at the scene, and no one knew about the plot to instigate the massacre of the protesters until years later. It worked, though. There were no more protests. Story 3. Ernest Hemingway suffered from ongoing paranoia that the FBI was surveilling him, which was thought to be a key factor in his suicide. Most chalked it up to mental illness at the time. Decades later, his file was released, proving he was under investigation for his ties to Cuba. His phones were tapped, and he was right all along. Story 4. In the spring of 1968, President Lyndon Johnson shocked the nation when he announced that he would not seek election to a second full term that November. He gave no explanation, and pretty much everyone assumed that it was because of the situation in Vietnam and his resulting unpopularity. While Vietnam undoubtedly was a factor, it was far from the full story. Concerned that males in his family tended to die young, and having barely survived a heart attack in the 1950s, sometime in 1967, Johnson had commissioned a top-secret actuarial study to determine his likely lifespan. After carefully going through his family history and medical records, the actuaries concluded that Johnson was unlikely to survive to age 65. Johnson quickly did the math and realized that would give him a very short retirement if he ran and won in 1968, as he'd be 64 at the end of the term. This led him to decide against running. The actuaries were right, as Johnson never made it to 65, dying at age 64, and indeed, it would have been a very short retirement. Had he served a second full term, he would have died less than 24 hours after the end of the term. Story 5. Shortly after JFK's assassination, his favorite mistress, artist Mary Pinchot Meyer, was also assassinated while on a walk in Georgetown. It was an execution-style killing, one bullet to the chest, another to the head. She had no purse and was not sexually assaulted. Her ex-husband, Cord Meyer, worked for the CIA. Mary was known to disbelieve the conclusions of the Warren Report and the lone gunman theory. After her murder, the CIA's head of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton, was caught breaking into her studio trying to locate her diary. He eventually found it with the help of Mary's sister and brother-in-law and supposedly destroyed it. A black man, Ray Crump, was found in the vicinity of Mary's body and was arrested for murder despite no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. He was defended by famed civil rights lawyer Dovey Johnson Roundtree, who ripped the prosecution's case to shreds. Crump was acquitted. During the case, future Washington Post editor and JFK pal Ben Bradlee lied on the witness stand. He told the court he had no further information of interest to the case, omitting his knowledge of Angleton's attempts to destroy potential evidence. You see, Bradlee was the brother-in-law who helped Angleton locate the diary. He was married to Toni Pinchot, Mary's sister, and Mary's studio was located on their property. Story 6. There's a psychological reaction called the backfire effect, which essentially means that people, after they're given proof that what they think they know is absolutely wrong, will believe their misinformation even more deeply. Story 7. There are government-built bunkers dotted around the U.S. that holds a total of 1.4 billion pounds of cheese. The government was buying excess milk to prop up the dairy industry, turning it into cheese and shoving it underground since the end of Prohibition up until the Reagan administration. The Got Milk ad campaign was a government-funded psyop to get Americans to consume more dairy. I sound like a f***ing crazy person, but it's real. Story 8. There was one recorded homicide in New York City on September 11, 2001. The people who died because of the attacks weren't considered part of the homicides for that day, because a very high number like that is a statistical outlier that would throw off accurate record numbers. The one person who was murdered was a Polish immigrant named Henryk Siwiak, who was nowhere near the attacks. He was killed in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn at around 11:40 p.m. Story 9. COINTELPRO is straight-up conspiracy theory sounding, but 1000% true. They even sent letters to MLK telling him to commit self-destruction. No wonder people believe that the US government is probably doing other shady shit, because they probably are. Story 10. Probably going to be buried, but this one is actually kind of funny. Sometime after World War II, the US was doing some pretty wild experiments, including trying to see if they could teach dolphins to talk. They believed this was only achievable by full immersion, so they built a house and filled it with water and had a researcher live with the dolphin. The dolphin was a young male and wouldn't respond to anything unless the female researcher jacked it off. It became too obsessed with the researcher, and I think when the higher-ups found out what was going on, they shut it down and never tried again. Kind of paraphrased, but yeah, the government paid a load of money just to end up having a lady whack off a dolphin. Story 11. Operation Northwoods. The US government proposed having the CIA commit terrorist attacks in major US cities so we could blame them on Cuba and go to war. The proposals called for CIA operatives to both stage and commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets, blaming them on the Cuban government and using it to justify a war against Cuba. The possibilities detailed in the document included the remote control of civilian aircraft, which would be secretly repainted as U.S. Air Force plane, a fabricated shoot-down of a U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft off the coast of Cuba, the possible assassination of Cuban immigrants, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating terrorism in U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by President John F. Kennedy. Story 12. Alcohol poisoning during Prohibition. As you know, in 1919, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was prohibited, but instead of plummeting, alcohol sales soared. Speakeasies opened everywhere, and as a result, people in some neighborhoods were drinking even more than before. The mafias got in on the act, stealing large quantities of industrial alcohol. In 1926, the authorities resorted to the hard way, asking manufacturers to add toxic substances to their alcohol, adding 10 times more methanol, for example. In New York alone, 1 to 100 drinkers were poisoned and 400 died. A wave of deaths would eventually sweep across the country. This poisoning policy was not stopped until December 1933. Story 13. Another fact that's not a conspiracy is that the Armour, a thyroid replacement for hypothyroidism, was grandfathered in when the FDA was created. Armour is made from desiccated pig thyroid and has worked really well for 100+ years. But in the 1960s, Synthroid, levothyroxine, a synthetic version of the T4 hormone, was created. Medical schools then taught doctors to only give this to their hypothyroid patients. Old-timers still preferred taking Armour because they experienced no side effects, unlike Synthroid. Then the advent of the internet introduced online message boards. Hypothyroid patients, mostly women, shared how they didn't feel great on Synthroid and learned about Armour as an alternative. They started switching to Armour and felt fantastic. Guess what happened? The makers of Synthroid were afraid of their declining market share, so they lobbied the FDA to mandate a reformulation of Armour to extend its shelf life. Ever since that happened, Armour was never the same again, and more women report the same side effects that they experienced on Synthroid. Story 14. In the 60s and 70s, thousands of Native American women were sterilized without their consent as part of a practice to sterilize poor and minority women to help their financial situation and their families' quality of life by preventing unwanted pregnancies in poor communities. Some were not informed at all and had it done to them completely without their knowledge. Others were threatened with having their health care taken away if they did not agree to have it done to them. Some studies estimate that as many as 25–50% of Native American women were sterilized in the 1970s, representing tens of thousands of victims. This is essentially a modern-day genocide in the United States. Story 15. Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in New York City on August 10, 2019. On August 9, 2019, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, but no one took his place. The 2 guards who were assigned to check his jail unit that night fell asleep and did not check on him for about 3 hours. 2 cameras in front of Epstein's cell also malfunctioned that night. Story 16. The retroreflectors placed on the moon by the Apollo astronauts. I was quite taken with the faked moon landings conspiracy for a while, until Sir Patrick Moore, longtime presenter of a BBC TV astronomy show, dismissed the conspiracy theories in a single line by pointing out that astronomers, both amateur and professional, have been using these retroreflectors to calibrate their telescopes ever since 1969, when they were placed on the lunar surface by the Apollo astronauts. Story 17. Oil, rubber, and car companies influenced government agencies to pull funding from public transit and focus more on policies favoring the use of private vehicles. That's why public transit is poor in so many places in the US that had far more robust transit systems in the first half of the 20th century. White flight and redlining also contributed to this, drastically increasing the size of unwalkable suburban areas and languishing cities. Story 18. A poor black woman, Henrietta Lacks, cells were harvested from her dead body without her consent in 1951 by a doctor who worked for Johns Hopkins. The cells were proven to be incredible and a scientific marvel and have been used ever since to further medical science. Her family and descendants were never asked for consent to do this, weren't informed of the breakthroughs, have continued to live in crippling poverty since, despite how often the HeLa cells are used and the mass amount of money Johns Hopkins makes, and still to this day are fighting Johns Hopkins to admit their mistakes and make them financially whole for their desecration of a Henrietta Lacks body. Story 19. The McDonald's PR machine tried to ruin Stella Liebeck's life. That coffee was so hot it melted her clothing to her genitals. People still believe she was at fault. I turn it around and ask how they'd feel if a parent accidentally spilled coffee on their child that was so hot it melted the child's clothes to his body. Somehow it usually wakes people up. Story 20. Earthworms are an invasive species and ruin our forests. Passenger pigeons were the species of land vertebrate with the highest population to ever exist. At 6 billion, we killed every last one in about 100 years. Every time you see a town in the United States called Pigeon Forge or Pigeon Bend, you normally see a place named after the most prolific species to ever exist. They were the primary source of protein the world over, and only following their extinction did fish become so. They were a keystone species, and entire ecosystems are still suffering the shockwave of their extinction. You know those sticky briars that cling to your clothes and kill your pet if they eat them when you walk through the woods? Well, they ate them. You know Lyme disease? Well, there wasn't food on the forest floor for vermin, so it didn't crop up till they died either. All those weird nursery rhymes with pictures of pies with bird feet sticking out, that's them too. How America wanted the pigeon as its national bird before the eagle, that's them. And today, until you read this, you probably didn't even know that America lost its single most identifiable species, a defining feature of our continent, and no one cares. Story 21. PR and advertising firms are actively engaging in psychological warfare to push certain viewpoints and values in both implicit and explicit ways. If you control a person's thoughts, emotions, and reactions, then you can begin to control their behavior in almost any sphere of life. The way you worded that sounds similar to the BITE model, a way to determine if something is a cult. It stands for behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. If you isolate people from the outside world and control these aspects of their world, then you can keep them brainwashed and in your control. Story 22. The Trump campaign colluded with Russia in 2016. Trump's campaign manager gave GOP polling data to a Kremlin agent, went to prison for lying about it before Trump pardoned him. That's Russian collusion. There wasn't sufficient evidence to claim Trump himself colluded, although the final report does document 11 instances where Trump himself obstructed the investigation, including when he literally fired the head of the FBI and said publicly it was to end the investigation. Story 23. MLK Jr.'s family sued an alleged conspirator of the United States government for his wrongful death and won, proving that the governmental agencies were involved in his killing. The King family asked for $100 in compensation as the point wasn't to win money, but simply to prove there was a conspiracy by the US Gov to kill the civil rights leader. This is important info is left out of most US public education, and when I tell people, they don't believe me, even though it's a public record. Story 24. Several of the top medical journals are funded by pharmaceutical companies, as are many politicians, and a lot of people in the FDA have industry histories. You can't expect most research to be unbiased, and bias in what research makes it to publication is rampant. Also, the FDA doesn't run clinical trials, it regulates them. The companies get away with a lot to make their products look good when doing the tests. Story 25. The DARPA LifeLog project was an attempt to collect and store enough data about people to be able to trace the threads of an individual's life in terms of events, states, and relationships, and have the ability to take in all of a subject's experience from phone numbers dialed and email messages viewed to every breath taken, step made, and place gone. It was shut down in January 2004 after criticism concerning the privacy implications of the system. A little-known website went live in February 2004 named Facebook. All the above are facts, as if it is a coincidence or something nefarious is a conspiracy theory. Story 26. The CIA did fake vaccination drives in Afghanistan to collect DNA from random people hoping to get a match with bin Laden. The idea was that if someone related to him was close by, then he was probably around too. This caused massive distrust of healthcare workers giving out real vaccines. They were getting attacked and got pulled out, and single-handedly set back efforts to eliminate polio by decades. Why couldn't they just give out real vaccines at the same time? CIA is too evil for that, I guess. Story 27. That there are private groups with economic power rivaling nations that meet up each year in not-so-secret locations to discuss how they want to push things politically. That the U.S. government will use military force to look after the economic interests of private U.S. corporations. This next one is all the pieces fit, and the only thing that is missing is people flat out saying that, yes, we did that. In 1974, the U.S. overthrew the legitimately elected government of Australia, a long-term ally, in order to protect the U.S.'s cheap leasing of land in Australia. Story 28. The national debt doesn't mean anything useful in the way we're told it does. The deficit as a concept for representing an impending doom, if it is not reduced, has been created by political activists and think tanks funded mostly by the ultra-wealthy and has become deeply ingrained into the American psyche. The concept became extremely popular as a fear-mongering tactic during the Reagan administration and weaponized by good government, no government type to win elections. All of this despite constantly being to blame for the largest deficit increases under their watch. Story 29. The Japanese hid hundreds of billions of dollars worth of gold and other stolen wealth in 175 different underground locations around the Philippines and other islands of that region during the last years of World War II. This stolen gold is the origin of the Marcos family's wealth. General MacArthur, other generals, and U.S. intelligence officials knew about these treasure locations and protected the Japanese royal family and elite all throughout World War II. The U.S. has used these resources since 1947 as covert off-the-books funding for all our CIA-related shenanigans. Every president since Truman has been aware of these funds, which as of 2005 were located in banks of at least 42 different countries, including the Vatican. Story 30. American insurance companies make more money being subsidized by taxpayer dollars than they do from people getting insured. They collaborate, for lack of a better term, with politicians and health providers to make sure the cost of treatment is high. So high that, in fact, not having insurance is not an option. Pharma wins because it gets subsidized and makes more money from virtually jacking their prices. Insurance companies get to keep their business, and politicians get their campaigns funded. Everyone wins but the taxpayer, who has been fooled into thinking socialized healthcare could never work and whose taxes are already paying for the largest chunk of treatment. Story 31. Any beef imported into the United States can say "made in the USA" if the value is added after importation. So if cattle are slaughtered and the halves are shipped here and broken down and packaged after they arrive, that is adding value to the product. Because value was added, every package can say that it is a product of the USA with no mention of its country of origin. Story 32. It's pretty much fact now, but that Michael Jackson's face was getting lighter was because he wanted to look white would be my answer. Dude had vitiligo and most people didn't know it was a medical condition before most had internet access. I certainly didn't. Despite how celebrated he was a victim of racism and so much more. He certainly had other issues as well, like Peter Pan syndrome, but the skin thing has always stuck with me. Also, lots of people think he was a pedophile. I don't. He was troubled because of his father and regressed emotionally. Still, a hard time for anyone to deal with. Story 33. The NSA built a data center in Utah with ridiculous amounts of storage, enough for libraries of each living person. The Utah state government gives tax write-offs to major data centers across the nation to relocate to Utah. Nothing goes into this pipeline that isn't stored for metadata for crawling through. Major presidential candidates are pushing for anonymous online accounts to be illegal. Google, YouTube, etc. are pushing for users to use their public information online. There is no privacy online anymore. They're nearly completely building a public data environment where your every move is tracked. All they need anymore is a single warrant, and everything online you've been up to is available. Story 34. When boxed cake mixes first came out, women didn't like them because they felt like they were cheating their families since all they had to add was milk. They didn't consider it real baking. Note, this was a time when being a good homemaker was what women were encouraged to be above all else. The research showed that if they also had to add an egg, it felt more like baking and they would consider buying it. So, eggs are required for boxed cake mixes so people will feel like they are actually baking rather than being necessary. Powdered egg and milk can easily be added to the cake mix. Story 35. MKUltra. Conducted by the CIA in the 50s and 60s, MKUltra was a secret program that performed experiments on unwitting US and Canadian citizens with the ultimate aim of developing mind control techniques to be used for interrogation and torture. Some of the experiments included administering heroic doses of LSD without the patient's knowledge, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other forms of psychological torture. The existence of MKUltra was only revealed in the 1970s following an investigation by Congress. Most of the official documents were destroyed, leaving the program largely a mystery. Story 36. The original charter for Hamas, the democratically elected governing body of Gaza, had in it the outlined plan promise that Hamas would commit genocide on every Jewish person on earth if elected, especially the ones in Israel. Sounds like a Republican talking point to make Israel seem justified. But no, it's 100% fact, and that should tell you a lot about the current situation and who is most likely the bad guy. Hint. Normally, the side calling for genocide of a race of people is the bad guy. Story 37. Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to Vietnam to sabotage the peace talks and keep the war going to win the 1968 election. Basically, there were peace talks going on between North and South Vietnam in 1968 to end the war. Nixon was running on pulling out of Vietnam, but if LBJ ended the war, that would hurt Nixon's campaign. When President the military had a contingency plan for what if Nixon was drunk and wanted to nuke another country, which actually happened. Story 38. Every single one of us has a big data profile that includes information from social media, what did you read, when did you slow down scrolling, cookies from each site you visited, how long were you there, what did you click on, financial data, what did you buy at Walgreens with your membership, where are you spending your money, how much. Conversations, Siri, Alexa, Google Home, all of these are always listening, phone conversations, texts, education, what classes have you taken, what were your grades, and who were your teachers, RFID and IoT data. When do you drive through the toll booths? What is the layout of your house from your Roomba? When does your fridge go empty? What do your home security systems pick up? What do you keep your thermostats at? Location data. Where do you go and when? Where do you go the most? When are you at work? When are you home? Where do you park your car? Internet searches and history? Yep. This doesn't include everything, but it's real. These files are kept on each of us at big data analytics companies like Cambridge Analytica. Crazy how we just pretend we don't know.